Okay, welcome back. This is our first panel. The subject of the panel is quite loosely networks. And we'll have, for this one, 2 speakers in person and 2 speakers on a joint paper who will be presenting online. So I will ask Efe and Alexandra to turn on their video so that we can see them too. Hi, guys. I think you two will be the third paper. So we'll do the ones in-house presentations first. Let me just open the PowerPoint. Okay. Stop this share. Okay. And start this one. Right. Okay, actually, I think I'll introduce everyone at the same time, because it will save. Oh, no, I won't do that. I'll introduce Pınar first. Okay. So our first speaker today is Pınar, who completed her BA and MA degrees in international relations at Bilkent University. She received her PhD degree in international history from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Actually, that was what my BA was in, anyway. Her research interests include intellectual encounters between late imperial, early Soviet Russia and late Ottoman, early Republican Turkey. She is currently teaching as a part-time instructor at Middle East Technical University. And her paper is titled Russian Scholars, Orthodox Subjects, and Academic Mobility Between Russia and Palestine in the Late Ottoman Period. I will start her PowerPoint now and pass to her. And maybe Efe and Alexandra could flick their video off until I bring them back in. Okay. Okay, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, for your introduction. And thank you very much for the conference organizers. Today, I want to start my talk with the examples of 2 resourceful men who joined the Russian academic community in the late imperial period. The first one is Athanasios Papadopoulos Keramevs. Papadopoulos Keramevs was born in Ottoman Thessaly in the 1850s. He worked at the famous Evangelical Gymnasium in Izmir, then at the library of the Silogos Society in Istanbul. And finally, he worked as the chief librarian at the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. When he was in his 30s, Papadopoulos Keramevs was invited to Russia, where he taught modern Greek language at St. Petersburg University, and he compiled Greek manuscripts at the Imperial Public Library. My other example is Vandali Cevzi, or as he generally signed his name in Russian, Panteleimon Juze. Cevzi was born in 1870s in an Orthodox Arab family in Jerusalem. He studied first at the Russian school in Nazareth before continuing his education in Moscow and Kazan theological academies. And he finally ended up in Soviet Azerbaijan. In the 1920s, he was the dean of the Oriental Studies faculty at the Baku University, and he died in Baku in 1942. Cevzi, like Papadopoulos Keramevs, was a border crosser. In the late 19th century, there was fierce competition between Greek-speaking and Arabic-speaking Orthodox Christians for control over the Orthodox Church, especially in Greater Syria. However, these 2 notable scholars, one from a Greek-speaking and the other from an Arabic-speaking background, both found themselves under the aegis of Russian scholarly community. Their arrival in Russia does not mean that their intended audience was limited to Russian academia. These scholars disseminated their work beyond their adopted homeland, namely Russia. While Papadopoulos Keramevs was corresponding with European scholars to publish some of his works in Britain and France, Cevzi preserved his intellectual connection to his homeland and was publishing in Jerusalem and Beirut in the post-Ottoman period. Today, I will not talk so much about these two individuals. Rather, I want to focus on the extent of academic mobility between Ottoman Palestine and Russia in the late imperial period. With academic mobility, first and foremost, I mean the mobility of people, that of scholars and students. The mobility of people automatically brought the mobility of information and ideas, which will be the second focus of the paper. I basically try to answer three questions. So the institutional framework that made such academic mobility between Ottoman Palestine and Russia possible. I'm also interested in the actors that were involved in this mobility. And finally, I want to understand the implication of such academic connections for local Ottoman subjects, as well as for the Imperial Russian government in a broad sense. Let's start with the first question. In the late 19th century, Palestine was not only at the forefront of international political competition, it was also a busy and dynamic travel spot, attracting scholars, pilgrims, settlers, and adventurers of all sorts. Among the foreign travelers in Palestine, there was a large number of Imperial Russian subjects, both as settlers and pilgrims and scholars. In order to facilitate the journeys of Russian Orthodox pilgrims, as well as to back up Russian political presence in the region, the imperial government established the Palestine Committee in 1859 under the protection of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Shortly after, the committee became defunct, but it became the basis for a much more efficient institution which was established in 1882, the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society. The first president of the Palestine Society was Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, brother of Alexander III. However, in practice, the administrative head of the society was its secretary, Vasily Hitrova, a well-connected bureaucrat with ties to various branches of the imperial bureaucracy as well as the royal family. After a visit to Jerusalem in 1871, Hitrova penned a report in which he noted the miserable conditions of local Christians, strong Protestant and Catholic influence, and Greek control over the Orthodox population. In his report, Hitrova argued that Russia had a very crucial political interest in the Holy Land by the virtue of being the only heir to the Byzantine Empire. This role necessitated Russia to extend its protective wings not only for Orthodox Slavs, but for all Orthodox peoples, including Orthodox Arabs in Syria and Palestine. Hitrova was far from being alone in his enthusiasm for Russian expansionism, and he had similar-minded acquaintances in the royal family, bureaucracy, and academia. The Palestine Society was established only 1 year after Alexander III ascended the throne. Alexander's reign was marked by a heavy emphasis on orthodoxy as the main pillar of Russia's domestic and foreign policy. Therefore, it doesn't come as a surprise that the new Tsar was eager to extend Russia's wings to Orthodox believers in the Holy Land. From 1882 to 1914, the Palestine Society undertook archaeological excavations, offered administrative, financial, organizational support to academics and enthusiasts working on the history of the Levant, provided support to Russian pilgrims, opened schools and hospitals, and organized charity activities. Until the outbreak of the First World War, the Society opened nearly 100 schools in broader Greater Syria and Palestine. And despite brief intermissions in the 20th century, the Society still continues its activities in modern times. Until 1917, the Palestine Society published its scholarly activities in a journal, the Orthodox Palestine Collection, the journal you see here on the right, Palestinsky Zbornik. And it also had an annual bulletin of the Imperial Orthodox Palestinian Society, the journal you see on the left. And this is the insignia of the society. From the start, the activities of the Palestine Society were closely linked to international developments and political rivalries, especially it was related to the power game between Greek and Russian ecclesiastical authorities. Russian diplomats were longing for supplementing Russian political leadership over the Orthodox world with intellectual and religious leadership. However, in order to strengthen Russia's position over the Orthodox Church, they first had to counter the ecclesiastical supremacy of Greeks. Despite all odds, the Palestine Society became a platform that brought Russians and local Christians together as they hoped, most notably with Orthodox Arabs who wanted to free themselves from Greek influence. In the 1890s, relations between Greeks and Russians in Jerusalem deteriorated so much that Russians instead intensified their activities in Syria, where the Patriarch of Antioch offered cooperation. The Palestine Society proved to be very effective considering the high number of schools established in the region. But with its support for Orthodox Arab population, the Palestine Society also made a lasting support to Arab nationalism, particularly by helping diminish the power of Greek clergy in Syria. Now let's turn to our second question, the actors involved in the economic mobility between Russia and Ottoman Palestine. On the one hand, thanks to the financial support of the society, many prominent Russian Byzantinists, including people like Nikodim Kondakov or not only Byzantinists, but a number of different linguists and Orientalists like Nikolai Mar, spent time in Jerusalem thanks to the financial support of the society, and they conducted research in Syria and Palestine. On the other hand, more interesting for our purpose, the society helped create a bridge between Orthodox Ottoman subjects and Russia. The Palestine societies, by the way, this is the headquarters of the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society in Jerusalem today. The picture was taken by myself. The Palestine Society's proliferous publication activities included Ottoman subjects from different ethnic and social backgrounds. For instance, side by side with the anti-Greek statements of some of the most prominent members of the society, the society also contributed significantly to the study of Byzantine studies and collaborated with some of the most important Greek scholars in the field. The collaboration between Athanasios Papadopoulos Kerameves is just the best example of this contribution. Papadopoulos Kerameves published a series of manuscripts under the auspices of the Palestine Society, and he wrote critical introductions for these publications. The content of these manuscripts is outside the scope of this paper, but a few examples will be provided to shed light into the interest of these scholars. Can I just show the next slide? Some of the manuscripts the society published were travelogues written by Byzantine ecclesiastical figures, which included descriptions of the Holy Land. I should also like to note that Papadopoulos Kerameves secured a position as the head of the theological department of the Imperial Public Library in 1905 with the help of his network at the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. And this he did despite his lack of competence in Russian language. He also became an honorary member of the Kazan and St. Petersburg theological academies. And because of his financial difficulties, he sold a portion of his personal library to the Imperial Public Library in 1911, which you can still find in Russia in St. Petersburg. Therefore, Papadopoulos Kerameves was instrumental in the transfer of both intangible knowledge and tangible manuscript collections from Ottoman territories to Russia. Here you see some examples of Papadopoulos Kerameves' publications at Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society. Description of the holy places by an anonymous author. The Palestine Society clearly served as a hub for scholars from Russia, bringing them in contact with local intellectuals. However, education was the most important source of mobility between Syria, Palestine, and Russia. The Palestine Society opened numerous schools, most of them in Syria and Lebanon, thanks to the generous support by the Patriarch of Antioch, Meletius II. These schools were different from missionary schools established by Europeans because they offered education in Arabic, and most of the teaching staff were local Arabs. Nearly all teachers were actually from local Orthodox Arab population. The Russian schools in Greater Syria hence helped the strengthening of Arabic literary culture from the late 19th century up to the outbreak of the First World War. And here I want to provide some examples from the Palestine Society's publications in Arabic. So the society did not only publish manuscripts, but it also published works in Arabic, and it also made translations from Arabic to Russian and from Russian to Arabic. The Bandali Cevzi, whom I mentioned earlier in my speech, is just part of a broader phenomenon, actually. In 1887, the Palestine Society started providing scholarships to Orthodox Arab students who wanted to study in Russian theological seminaries and academies, which led to an increasing number of Arab students going back and forth between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. These border crossers included many interesting figures, and here I will just provide a few examples because my time is limited. For instance, the lady you see on the right is Gülsüm Nasr Vasilyeva. She was born in 1890s and she died in 1960s. She was, as far as I know, one of the first Palestinian women to become a professor, if not the first. And her ethnographic and literary research made her an important contributor to the field of Palestine studies. She started her education in Russian schools in Palestine. Then she married a Russian doctor, went to Russia before the revolution, and she became an academic during the Soviet period and during the tumultuous years of the Soviet Union throughout 1930s and 40s. She preserved her post in Moscow University, which was the most prestigious university in the Soviet Union. In 1928, by the way, she paid a short visit to Palestine for ethnographic studies. So during her time in the Soviet Union, she was coming back and forth between Palestine and Russia and the Soviet Union. And she also had contacts with Comintern and with the Palestine Communist Party. In fact, this academic mobility went beyond the borders of Russia and the Ottoman Empire and reached as far as the United States. I want to now offer another interesting example. Raphael of Brooklyn, this person you see on the left, the first Orthodox bishop consecrated in the United States. Raphael of Brooklyn was born as Rufai Havavini in Ottoman Beirut in 1860. He received his first education in Damascus and then at the Halki Seminary in Istanbul, and he finally studied at Kiev Theological Academy. In 1893, Raphael resigned from his position at the Patriarchate of Antioch and joined the Russian Church. He also taught Arabic language at the Kazan Theological Academy. In the 1890s, the Russian Bishop of Alaska, whose authority extended all over the United States, asked the Russian Emperor Nicholas II to appoint a Syrian priest with Russian education who could speak Russian for the growing Syrian population in New York City. In 1895, Raphael headed to New York on the orders of Nicholas II and served as the Bishop of Brooklyn until his premature death in 1915. And this person you see next to Raphael is Bandali Cevzi, whom I mentioned previously. By the way, Bandali Cevzi is also known for his work on the intellectual history of Islam. And actually in this book, he came up with some of the theories Edward Said mentioned only in 1970. So he is also a very interesting intellectual figure. People who studied at Russian schools in Syria and Palestine and who continued their education in Russia later became important contributors to Oriental studies, first in the Russian Empire and then in the Soviet Union. Bandali Cevzi compiled one of the first Russian Arabic dictionaries. Another notable figure was Tevfik Kezma, the third person. He was a Palestinian born in Damascus, and he published books on Arabic and Turkish philology and literature. He became a member of Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in the Soviet period and published the first Ukrainian Arabic dictionary. And he died as a citizen of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist state. Actually, I have already partially discussed this, but let's sum up once again the implications of such academic and intellectual connections between Palestine and Russia for local population. The diverse channels of communication that fostered Russian academic culture show that knowledge production, at least in Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union, was not a process concentrated in imperial centers such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, but it was the result of a dialogue and negotiation between various local groups and the imperial center. For instance, knowledge on Arabs and their history was produced in dialogue with people of Arab origin, and in most cases by people of Arab origin themselves. Further research on the process in which these people were integrated to the academic system would show the extent of inclusiveness of the academic community and the potential for social mobility for people of diverse origins. Despite the extensive work undertaken by the Palestine Society, there were of course limits of Russian influence in the Near East. Russian Empire was only one of the many foreign governments operating in this region. In addition to Russian schools, there were many Italian, French, American schools in Palestine and Syria. The French clergy who were dissatisfied with the anti-clerical policies at home, for instance, especially took the lead in terms of establishing missionary schools in the Near East. And they also combined their educational and religious activities with archaeological and scholarly studies. European nations also strengthened their positions by establishing scientific or humanitarian societies. Yet there were some tangible results of Russian presence. As in the Balkans, Russian cultural activities in Palestine and Syria did not bring about Russian dominance in the region as such, but they led to the strengthening of local national feeling. In the Balkans, Russians had Serbian and Bulgarian national awakening, and in the Near East, they had Orthodox Arabs develop national consciousness. This is not exactly what the Russian Empire intended to do. Of course, they just wanted to create greater influence, but they were financially and politically limited. And after all, we are talking about an empire that completely disintegrated by 1917. On the part of the Imperial Russian government, there were some important repercussions of the flow of students from Ottoman Palestine and Syria to Russia, especially for the post-imperial period. The channels of communication between the Levant and Russia established in the imperial period influenced how Bolsheviks interacted with nations around their borders. For instance, the mobility of intellectuals and scholars between the Levant and the Soviet Union continued well into the 20th century, into the mid-20th century, a legacy of the seed sown by the Palestine society. But this came with unintended consequences. In the 19th century, when imperial statesmen established this society and this institutional framework, they hoped to create Orthodox solidarity between Orthodox Arab subjects and Russia by emphasizing Orthodoxy and by establishing schools for Orthodox Arab children. However, by a twist of fate and quite paradoxically, these educational institutions led to the emergence of secular intellectuals, some of whom converted to Marxism and held permanent academic positions in the Soviet Union. So whether the imperial statesmen were successful in their endeavors, it's an open question. We can debate its extent, but definitely this scholarly activities had a quite different purpose than they intended. After all, imperial statesmen were not, they didn't really envision that their schools would create scholars like Gülsüm Vasilieva, who became a Palestinian woman, engaged in Comintern. So this was not the intention of imperial statesmen for sure, but this was the result. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm waiting for questions.
Okay. Thanks so much, Pınar. What we're going to do, by the way, is take all of the questions at the end of the panel. So if you have a question, though, you are welcome to use the Q&A box. You ask it now, we'll get to it at the end of the panel. Now, I'm sorry that there was some difficulty. I understand that for many people, the right portion of the screen of the PowerPoint slide was not visible. So I'm going to try and fix that now, and then we'll run through Pınar's slides, and then once we fixed it, and then so that everyone has a chance to see the full slide, and then we'll start on with Gizem's, hopefully with everything visible. So please give me a second. All right, so we shall. Let's try doing this portion of the screen. That's too complicated. Okay, how about now? Does everyone see the full extent of the slide? Yes, okay, that's great.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, super, sorry for that. Okay, now I'll run through Pınar's slides briefly so that everyone gets a chance to see them. And then we'll do the same thing, we'll use the same settings for Gizem Pilavcı's paper. Okay. So perhaps, I mean, those of you at home can take a screenshot if you, rather than trying to read through everything at once. That was the two journals. There's the society headquarters. Further publication. Okay, that's all of them. Okay, so apologies again for that technical difficulty. Now I will stop that sharing and open the next PowerPoint. Okay, let me first introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Gizem Pilavcı. She's a colleague of mine here at the British Institute at Ankara, and she's a historian of the Ottoman Empire, specializing in the Armenian experience and impact on Ottoman society in the late modern period. She recently completed her DPhil at the University of Oxford, where she researched the lives of the members of the virtually unstudied Catholic Armenian Manases family, who operated in the fields of art, diplomacy, and finance, and analyzed the social and political ramifications of the family's Catholic identity. And she'll be presenting some of her research on the Manases family in a paper entitled Artful Diplomacy as Modus Itineris, Reflections on the Journeys of the Hyphenated Manases Across Europe. I'll now start her PowerPoint, and perhaps one of our panelists who's not in the room can tell us that it looks okay. Oh, that's the wrong one. Yeah, okay. Sorry. You're this one, aren't you? Is that it?
Yeah.
Yes. This one, okay?
Yeah.
Let's talk to. Okay, how does that look? Okay, everyone says it looks good. Great. Okay, I'll pass this to you.
So thank you, Daniel, and a huge thank you to everyone who's involved in the organization of this workshop. Before getting into the main body of the paper, I would actually like to take a few minutes to talk about my conceptual framework, methodology, and geography of analysis. Given the time constraints, I will offer a brief survey of my most important findings, though I will not be able to get into each facet that I explored in this paper. I will reflect on the challenges of studying Rupen and Sabuk Manas, as well as the limitations of the present work, while also pondering on the merit of the subject matter and the ways in which a study using these actors as a nexus is able to problematize current historiographical traditions and offer a corrective. I will then reflect on the Manases mobility and discuss what factors may have prompted and enabled it. I will conclude with a few questions that I hope will spark new avenues of research on this topic. So building on the work that I have done for my dissertation project, the aim of this paper has been to apply the specific lens of movement to study the peripatetic existence of two cosmopolitan individuals, Rupen and Sabuk, who hailed from the Catholic Armenian Manases family of court painters, diplomats, and bankers, among other professionals. This new conceptual framework of analysis of 19th century cross-cultural exchange and mobility, informed by a global connected history approach, gives new meaning to the previously collected body of data that yields new insights about the stories of the Manas brothers and their sojourns and long stays in Europe. So as I said, I have applied a connected interactive history approach rather than a comparative or an insular one. And my method has been microhistory, and I have zoomed in on the individuals and prioritized the individual dimension. I have also used prosopography when using the family unit as a backdrop for the analysis of Rupen and Seul, which enables some of the otherwise unintelligible choices and aspirations of the Manas brothers to become legible and offer further context to fill in some of the extensive lacunae in their individual stories. The geography and landscape of analysis has been global. So I will be assessing the Manases using the context of the Ottoman Empire and then switching to a global optic unbound by national circumscriptions, while also not losing sight of the nation as a reference point, informing the individuals in question. My time period of immediate focus has been the 1840s up through the 1870s, bordering the median period. Yet, I have attempted to situate the Manases more broadly in the long 19th century. So Rupen Manas, he migrated back and forth between Paris and Istanbul from 1846 until 1854, and served as secretary of the Paris embassy from 1854 up through at least 1861, before becoming consul general of Milan in 1866, a position he continued to occupy until 1871. Sebuh Manas, on the other hand, served as a translator of the Paris embassy from 1852 until at least 1862. And after these dates, we lose their traces in the almanacs that list diplomatic personnel employed around the world. And while it is unclear when they return to Istanbul, a few years later, we pick up their trace once again at the capital. The aim of the paper then is to offer a métissage where Ottoman actors of various backgrounds and ethnicities are approached as being part of the same tale, whose aspirations and experience are evaluated at a global level. This analysis assesses the Manases as cosmopolitan, hyphenated historical actors and cultural elites with a solid cultural background and wherewithal in a way that transcends their social, ethnic, confessional, and professional layers of identity, while also using these subjectivities to decipher and reflect on their individual motivations, experiences, career choices, and thought processes that enabled and prompted their mobility. So I attempted to place the Manases into a framework that they naturally belong in, not as marginal types, but as part and parcel of Ottoman social fabric. And so to study the Manases also in the same ecosystem as the soldier painter Ottomans and their Muslim diplomat counterparts, as well as global actors operating in a global context. By doing so, I have attempted to restore the agency and impact of the Manases as actors in the broader Ottoman and global settings, rather than confining them to their self-contained category and diluting their impact. They were not extraneous to the axes of social and political change, but were historical actors participating in a very real way in the image making and brand management of the Ottoman state through their dual pursuits. Setting some excellent works aside, the paper problematizes both Turkish and Armenian historiographical traditions for the still prevalent myopic nationalist tendencies, the conscious decontextualization of the Armenian experiences, and their divorcing from their Ottoman context, as well as notions of lacrimosity and undifferentiated passivity and victimhood, which effectively overlook Armenian agency and impact, and thereby it offers a corrective. Studying the Manases also allows for a problematization of the oft-reproduced center-periphery logic of belatedness, of the works of Ottoman painters produced in the Western modality following the visual language of 19th century French academic painting being characterized as mimetic, derivative, and bereft of value, as well as court art's dismissal as propaganda that is devoid of artistic persona. So I have had certain challenges.
the left, you're clicking the right click. There we go.
So Rupen Manas is the person on the left and Sebuh is the person on the right. So I have had obviously some challenges, while working on the Manases, and also and I will also reflect on some of the limitations of this paper. So the incomplete data laid by the material that survives limits our ability to access the Manases social and mental universe, as well as the nature of the corpus that has come down to us. While among the material used for the study, there are a handful of documents written by the Manases themselves. Most are about them rather than being by them. And even the ones that are by them are usually very formal documents, they're formal correspondence rather than being private exchanges, and hence are subject to requirements of a very specific predetermined style. In this way, sort of the lack of Zeugnisse, it actually prevents us from accessing the mental universe of the Manases and their Weltanschauungen with ease. So as I have previously mentioned, I have attempted to place the Manases, figure them into a global artistic and diplomatic network, and understand their lives as one among the many artists and diplomats who were based in Europe, immersing in similar activities, partaking in the global diplomatic and artistic culture of the period, as well as assessing them against the backdrop of the artist diplomat in a global sense. The Manases were ultimately global cosmopolitan individuals who had coveted skills and cultural backgrounds which made them assets in the employ of their governments. It is important to recognize that in an ecosystem where Ottoman diplomats were given instructions, yet not detailed directions as how to proceed, a certain inventiveness was expected from them, and this allowed for more individual agency, incentive, and personal autonomy, which is characteristic of the period. This was a diplomatic culture that the Manases partook in. Obviously, this changed during the Hamidian era with increased bureaucratization, codes of conduct emerging, and more micromanagement. Therefore, it is possible to deduce that given the system relied on the individual's ability and clever strategies to come to favorable adjustments by grafting themselves onto power networks, carving out a place for themselves in the social and diplomatic system, partaking in the social and professional culture, and yield personal influence, who the state thought would make for effective diplomats, emerges as a powerful moment of decision-making. And this was a global concern and expectation. So diplomacy was a very social endeavor for all global actors involved. A diplomat's day in pre-1914 Paris illustrates the unbureaucratic style with luncheons, birthday celebrations, exhibitions, theater and opera, and recreational activities such as hunting and informal spa meetings in the context of balneal or spa diplomacy, which were as much linked to his profession as were formal negotiations, conferences, and diplomatic correspondence. So this global understanding of what it meant to be a diplomat and the shared vision that the diplomat's strengths lay in the number of connections that their continent-wide social networks provided was also reflected in the Ottoman case. It is unclear to what extent the Manases or other Ottoman diplomats joined in on these events, given the great degree to which diplomacy was conducted in social spaces and effective diplomatic arrangements were arrived at, sometimes in these very social settings. The lack of funding of Ottoman diplomats may have prevented them from joining these to the extent that they would have, were they to receive adequate salaries. So now I want to reflect on what prompted and enabled their mobility. And I guess I would like to maybe just go, yeah, actually, just, yeah, this one's good. So I will talk about their paintings after, but I can sort of stay on this slide. So what prompted and enabled their mobility? These are obviously two separate questions, though they may, feed into one another. So there's obviously sort of opportunities that the historical sort of juncture also ushered in. But I argue that while it is, difficult to answer this question, sort of what prompted their mobility, then what enabled it, I would argue that the 1828 sort of Catholic exile, which the Manases were forced into, may have had an impact in this regard. So this was sort of, as I said, happened in 1828, and many of the sort of the Catholics living in Istanbul were forced out. And this happened when Rupen was 14 and Sebuh was 12, and they had much younger siblings and cousins with them, some of whom were toddlers. And this was particularly impactful and very traumatic, as many children died in the winter cold. So the Catholic millet was established in 1830, but this experience and the trauma of 1828 exile would have unquestionably been formative for the Manases' views of the world. While the tides had turned in favor of the Catholic Armenians, who had suffered for centuries for their liminality under pressure from the Armenian Patriarchate as well as the Ottoman court, the previously personae non grata designated as seditious troublemakers in numerous state documents. So they were given legal recognition by the state in 1830. It is unclear, though, whether they believed this would prevent any future persecution, with exile and displacement having been such a constant and imminent threat. Perhaps it had become cemented in the collective psyche of Catholic Armenians. And they may have opted to be based outside the empire in Europe to ensure their freedom of mobility. Rupen, it might be actually valuable to mention here that Rupen and Sevo's father, Zeno, he actually joined foreign service as soon as Ottoman diplomatic offices were reopened by Mahmud II in 1834. So what enabled it? There are so many sort of answers we can give to this question. So obviously the historical juncture proved favorable. So with the changing composition of the Ottoman diplomatic enterprise, while many influential Phenaiot Greeks kept occupying some of the highest offices, there was an opening for others, and the Manases seized this favorable moment, and as well as a more liberal movement regime of their times, as opposed to, say, the Hamidian sort of regime with its crustacean borders that cracked down on Armenian mobility in the 1890s. Obviously, their skill sets was a great enabler. Their fluency in French, both linguistically and artistically. In addition to their cosmopolitan education and immersion in languages and cultures, which were intimately connected to the enterprise of foreign affairs and statecraft. So while the investigation of the professional lives of the artists and diplomats of the family reveals a balanced motivation between these two pursuits, their skill and success in painting served as a foundation on which to build and further a diplomatic career. Their Catholic background may have had a positive networking effect as well. So they were of great value for the Ottoman state, and they had become the embodiments of the new regime and mentality that they also created and reproduced through the visual language of their artworks for polychromatic audiences, which, as they traveled, entered into new sites of reception and acquired new meanings. Of course, their patronage ties to the Ottoman court that their predecessors had forged and which they were able to successfully activate played a role. So especially given that in this sort of setting, we have a lot of competition for visibility on the part of the many artists that emerge, perhaps the centuries-long connection that the Manases had to the court gave them an upper hand over these other individuals. And also, obviously, their financial background. So their mobility and undertaking of less than lucrative careers in diplomacy and painting were perhaps also enabled by the fact that the Manases were a family of some means. While Rupen and Sevo's father, Zeno, was not a financier, and he was actually the only son of Menasi Manas who didn't engage in banking. The other three sons, Puzant, Mugurdic, and Nasip, were all involved in banking. Zeno was actually able to take advantage of the patents of exemption that his banker father had been granted. And on his passing, on Menasi's passing, he was able to have this patent renewed under his own name, and in a way that covered his sons as well. So the Manases continued to be able to take advantage of having bankers in the family, in a sense. And while the Manases were not an Amira family, as Pınar postulates, and many other actually people think this mistakenly, perhaps with the exception of Menasi, who may have held this prestigious title in his lifetime, both non-Muslims and Muslims in diplomatic service, mostly coming from wealthy families, and in the case of the Armenians, mostly being the scions of financiers, can be applied to the Manases in a larger and more general sense. Rupen and Sevo were also in possession of some real estate, as they seem to have inherited a plot of land in sort of Beyoğlu, and also prestigious, sort of a small house in prestigious Tarabe neighborhood in the vicinity of the French embassy. They were also in the will of their formerly uncle, sort of banker uncle, Puzant Manas. I will not get into the details of that, but he was able to leave behind 14,800 kurush. And this was to be split between his nieces and nephews, his nephews Rupen, Sebu, Joseph, Gaspar, Anton, and Artin, and nieces Maria and Sophie. Beyond these assets to fall back on, Rupen and Sebu also supplemented their incomes via their artistic skills by earning additional sums with paintings that they made during their employment in diplomatic service. And this proved vital because of the sort of financial problems that kept plaguing the diplomatic enterprise, with many diplomats not being paid on time or in full. So they use this as to complement their diplomatic salaries in a way. And an additional factor in the successes of various Manases that become salient in the thorough review of their careers is the role of their familial connections and kinship network and support mechanism through the advocacy of the family on behalf of its members, the letters from, for instance, Paul and Manases' mother, and an unidentified relative whose identity is obscure. It should further be noted that Napoleon III advocated for Paul Manas based in part on his recognition of the family's reputation as a family on the sort of foreign diplomatic plane, a network of diplomatic agents that operate in European cities. Their kinship network and the esteem that they acquired through their own activities as well as their family name may have been further boosted by the Catholic Armenian network of the militarists. So in an internal correspondence from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Said Pasha, to Ambassador to Vienna, Saadullah Pasha, I have come across this sort of statement that this basically was sent after Puzant Manas had passed. And it reads that in the event of this information being lacking, however, the Vienna militaries would likely provide it. So the militaries had centers in Venice, Vienna, and Paris, and Puzant Manas was based in Vienna as a consul general of Vienna at the time of his passing. So this piece of information makes it likely, or at least something that we should consider, that like for the other Manases, Rupen and Sebu, that they may have had close ties to the militaries in Paris and to have made use of this network as well. So just like them, their works were mobile and had a transcultural character. It is unclear exactly where some of the Manases' art was displayed, though their paintings seem to have roamed continents, even more so than the Manases themselves, and become mobile objects of cultural exchange, imbued with a different set of meanings at each new encounter. So it is valuable to meditate on the imaginative geography of their works. So their artworks were displayed in palaces in various Ottoman and diplomatic settings, their portrait medallions being worn by the state elite, as well as some of their works being gifted to European monarchs. How am I doing in terms of time? Okay, almost. Okay, conclusion. So I obviously would have liked to discuss it further, but I will end it here and give a brief conclusion. So this paper is an exercise, has been an exercise in microhistory, which is a matter of process and is defined by its transparency with regard to how we can know what we do and identifying what remains unknown. Rather than being the culmination of the examination of the Manases in this through this lens, this was an effort to track the Manases. So the paper showcases the narrative bridges used to formulate a legible storyline and to read these individuals' motivations, instead of hiding the ambiguities of the historical record for the ease of the reader. And I hope this study inspires further research on the topic and is able to spark new vistas and avenues for future research. I'd like to end with a few questions that have remained unanswered. So to what degree were Rupen and Manas integrated into elite social circles, participating in the standard pastimes? Tied to this is a question of how able they were to participate in social diplomatic activities. With regard to their financial situation, it still remains to be determined what kind of artistic commissions they were able to secure from Ottoman and European patrons. Separately, it would be interesting to know if they participated in art collecting like other diplomats, or were charged by the sultans to identify or buy works on their behalf, the way Sheikh Ahmed Pasha did, for instance. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I couldn't get the slides, but it was basically to give a spatial sense.
Sure. Okay, well, thank you very much. Again, questions we'll deal with at the end of the panel. So if anyone had any questions for Gizem or for Pınar, add those to the Q&A and we'll get to them. Our next presentation is from Efe Erünal and Alexandra Koumpouli, ignore me, who are going to be talking on the topic of merchants, bankers, diplomats, socio-economic networks of the Glavany family and their imprints on Istanbul's urban fabric. I'll briefly give a biographical introduction to the two speakers. Efe Erünal is currently a PhD candidate at Koç University in Istanbul, where his ongoing thesis is concerned with the economic and demographic geography of the Bursa region in northwestern Turkey in the period 1820 to 1870. Besides Ottoman economy and demography, Efe's research interests include biographies, genealogies, and the history of everyday life in rural and urban settings. Alexandra Koumpouli is a practicing architect and a PhD candidate at Koç University in archaeology and art history. She holds a diploma in architecture and an MSc in restoration from the National Technical University of Athens. Her studies focus on the natural and anthropogenic landscapes and networks of the late Ottoman abandoned villages on the Adriatic coast of mainland Greece. So I'll now pass to them to give their presentation, and I'll disappear from your screens. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for hosting us. Efe and I, in our presentation, are going to explore the dynamics of family networks by focusing on the Glavany family, a Levantine merchant and moneylender family of the Ottoman Empire. So we will see the Glavany's within the concept of cultural mobility, which is the topic of this workshop. That said, we will explore how the international networks they created, as well as the general influence of the family through the interwoven identities of their members, such as ambassadors, bankers, urban actors, played an important role in the socio-economic change that the Ottoman Empire was undergoing during the 19th century. So the flexible role of the members of the Glavany family had an impact on the political and financial sectors. Actually, they strengthened these sectors. And at the same time, their name is still related to some urban and architectural projects in Istanbul and abroad. We consider the spatial dispersion of their activities as modes of travel and mobility, and at the same time as visual and power display within the Ottoman cultural scene. So Efe is going to analyze our work on the Glavany's and explore further all these topics. And then I will conclude with some further ideas for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks all. Let's first contextualize how the family came to be and how they established their networks. So the Levantine moneylenders were influential actors in financing the Ottoman imperial treasury and organizing large-scale trade since the 16th century. And their activities enhanced actually after the late 18th century because the Ottoman Empire needed cash to fund its prolonged wars with Russia and Austria and reform its costly modernization projects, which catapulted these moneylenders into large-scale financiers known as Galata bankers. Of course, Galata was the financial district in Istanbul since Byzantine times. Of course, I mean, these moneylenders, these bankers were also actors in negotiation with Europe because they had connections in European financial circles. So they were intermediating the first Ottoman foreign loan that was granted to the Ottoman Empire by the British and French on the eve of the Crimean War. And they were, the bankers were also influential in the opening of the first successful Ottoman bank in Galata in 1856, with branches in important port cities of the Ottoman Empire. Among the actors that played a key role was David Theodore Michel Glavany, which I will refer to him as David the Banker for the sake of following his name throughout the presentation. He was the French representative in the Crimean War Loan Commission. And after 4 years after the war ended, he was also tasked by the French with building a Christian orphanage in the Maronite in Mount Lebanon, following the bloody sectarian conflict between the Maronites and Durzis there. So, but I mean, had it not been for his networking capacities, then none of this would have happened, of course. Thanks to their Levantine identity, these moneylenders, these bankers were extremely influential in Ottoman circles. Because why? Because the Levantines were too European for the Ottomans and too Oriental for the Europeans. So their fluid and polyglot character helped them acquire wealth and networks and keep them as well. So don't get scared by this map. This is just to show you the family network that we are going to cover. Just know that this is a almost 4 centuries worth of family history told hopefully in 10 minutes or 15, something like that. So the Glavanys were actually originally a Genoese family based in Chios, Sakız Adası, since the mid-12th century. The earliest record with an occupation belongs to Giovanni Battista Glavany, who was the vice consul of France in Chios in the early 17th century. Of course, this is no coincidence because by that time, the British, French, and Dutch maritime activity was increasing in the Mediterranean, and they were, since Chios was located at the extremity of Izmir, these Levantine families were acting as intermediaries between Europeans or Westerners, if you generalize, and Ottomans. So as the foreign states established consulates in the Ottoman Empire throughout the 17th centuries, the Chiot families moved to Anatolia, and so did Glavany's as well. So we can follow their occupational trajectory in that sense, such as the Battista's grandsons, Bartolomeo Jean Baptiste, were merchants in Ankara and dragomans of the Dutch consulate there. Saverio, the third grandson, acted as the French consul in Crimea. So he had a daughter, which was depicted in this lovely picture. She is Mademoiselle Hélène Glavany. This is a painting by Jean-Étienne Lyotard, a very prominent Swiss painter based in Istanbul. She is wearing a Crimean Tatar headgear, if you look closely. And just to emphasize the networking capacities of the family, sitting next to her is Francis Levet, an English merchant in Constantinople, who was the partner of Andrew Turnbull, who was a British consul at Smyrna and actually found the new Smyrna colony in Florida. So we are talking about networks connecting the new and the old world, if you like. So the Crimean consul, Saverio, had a son, David Theodore. He is important because he was the first generation born and died in Istanbul. The family was moving to Istanbul more and more. He acted as a dragoman of the Dutch consul in Izmir for most of his life. Of his 2 sons, Gaspar procured arms and raw material for the Ottoman Navy through his connections in Smyrna, Moscow, and Hungary. And his other son was David the banker. I mentioned his name except for one thing. He was married to Anne Westerling, the daughter of a Dutch watchmaker and an important Levantine family member, an important Levantine family named Vuccino. So they together owned the Glavany Inn, which was replaced by the Ottoman Bank in 1891, which serves as the South Galata today. I think some of you might have been there in Istanbul. This is a very good for archival research as well. I suggest if you don't know the institution, Google it. So David the banker had a son, had multiple children, David and Anne, but probably the most interesting one is Faustin. He was the Brussels and Madrid Embassy Chief Secretariat, and he signed the loan agreement for the Rumelia Railroad project in 1875. because the Belgians were interested in building it to connect Istanbul to European heartlands through the Balkans. And this is a poster for the Chemin de Fer Oriental from 1898. And Faustin also was an architect, and he designed a monument for the entrance of the Suez Canal called the Temple de la Paix, designed actually to be displayed at the Paris exhibition. And he also added the commemorative inscription written in hieroglyphics, cuneiform script, Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, Latin, Turkish, and French. You can see the hieroglyphic inscription on the slide, definitely representing the main interest groups and the nationalities of the locals around the Suez Canal area. David's family was prominent in all regards. He had a little brother, Jacques. Jacques was a trader in the true sense of the word because he brought wheat from Beirut and sheep from Crimea. During his lifetime, he had shops in Istanbul, silk and cotton factories around the Marmara Basin, and a post-forwarding shipping agency in Istanbul. Jacques' son, Alfred Glavany, which we will hear about him in the coming slides, was no different. He was also interested in the railroad projects because such projects were developing in the last quarter of the 19th century. He sought to extend the tram line in Istanbul from Yeni Cami to Eyüp, but eventually got declined. Of course, this doesn't mean the Ottoman state didn't trust him. This is all about money speaking, basically. But he received an important mission by the Ottoman Empire. He supervised the migration of hundreds of thousands of Romanian Muslims to Anatolia after the disastrous Ottoman-Russian War of 1877 and 78. And possibly as a gift, he received the concession of the port of Beirut in 1887, and then he wanted to connect the port to its hinterland with a railroad, but he was so close to getting it, but in the same time, other interest groups blocked him from gaining access to that concession, and he failed in terms of railroads for the second time. So close to the end of the 19th century, the Glavany's were staying in Istanbul for longer periods, and hence their impact on the urban fabric was increasing accordingly. And of course, by this time, Istanbul was being rebuilt along Parisian ways and also the non-Muslim majority population of the Galata-Pera area was definitely helpful in that regard. So the family had a wooden mansion in Tepebaşı area where most family members resided. But unfortunately, we don't have a picture of it. The guys appearing on this picture are official Glavany's working as public debt administration officials after the Ottoman Empire went financially bankrupt in 1881. But we know that the wooden mansion was replaced by present-day London Hotel, which is this, the Hotel de Londres, Grand Hotel de Londres. So probably some of you might have been there as well. Of course, the wooden mansion might not be there. We might not have a depiction of it or a document of it, but definitely the family left an imprint on the area because the street next to it is known as the Kallavi Street. Kallavi is basically the bastardized version of Glavany, which appears so in the God map of Istanbul from 1905 as Impas Glavany. Across this street, the family had an apartment built on their name in 1896, which is in Postacılar Sokak, and it also hosts the consulate of the Republic of Ecuador. I don't know which floor, but other floors were rented by private individuals. So it is again contributing to different sort of global networks in it. So I mentioned Alfred Glavany before. We know it from the Ottoman archives that he owned a theater in Tepebaşı. It was destroyed due to inappropriate license in 1909. This might have been also politically motivated given the year, but we don't know much, or I haven't looked deeper into that issue. But definitely it wasn't rebuilt, so we don't know the specifics of that theater. But we definitely know one thing, that intermarriages helped the family build its prosperity and fame further. His daughter, Pauline, got married to a man named Selim Fresh. They were also a Levantine family, a prominent Beirut Maronite family based in Istanbul. Selim owned this very building, the Fresh apartments, which was built for him up in the late 19th century as basically a residence. This adorns the Tepebaşı Şişhane region, and it is a fine example, characteristic expression of the 19th century eclecticism. The couple also owned, this was built in 1906, sorry, in the early 20th century. Alexandra Warren, thanks. The couple also owned the seafront mansion in Fındıklı, helping Istanbul's urban expansion beyond its historical confines. So this is a map of the traces of the Glavany family network in Beyoğlu, Galata, and beyond in Fındıklı. As you can see, they have different extant buildings there. So what is not included in this map of Istanbul is a mansion built further away in Kandilli in the mid-19th century by the infamous David the Banker. Although the family still keeps it as a private property, they had some issues with the state when the state wanted to appropriate it for different reasons. Unfortunately, it got destroyed recently by treasure hunters and got its final shape on the picture on the right. Hope it will be rebuilt by their help because they seem to have a lot of money. This is a postcard written to one resident because many family members also were born and died in that Kandilli mansion. And this is a postcard, for instance, written to Mademoiselle Helen Glavany, a resident of that mansion in the 19th century. So the family members are, most family members are resting in peace at the Feriköy Catholic Cemetery in Istanbul. They were baptized there as well, some of them, as far as their baptism records show. Members of the family left Turkey after the foundation of the Republic, shortly after that, and they went to France. Of course, they continued to become influential, such as the family included such important people as Roland Glavany, an important war pilot during World War II, and an aeronautical engineer for the French Air Forces, and his son, Jean Glavany, who was the agriculture minister of France between 1998 and 2002. So this is a map of areas associated with the activities of the Glavany family members. As you can guess, this is a very dense network of wealth and comfort and diplomatic connections, which helped Glavany's rise into prominence in the Ottoman Empire and still effectiveness in global political and financial circles as well.
To sum up, with this archival research, we try to bring different urban histories together related to the Glavany family and to portray them as urban, political, and economic actors. So this international network they built was a mode of, or presents modes of mobility and travel. And at the same time, the urban projects and architectural projects that were involved were their tangible signatures within different urban settings. Considering that there were many other prominent Ottoman families with similar activities or even greater activities, researchers on similar directions can help us to a better understanding of these family networks as hubs of incorporation into the world economy. And the more activities they were undertaking, they were granted with more agency, thus more space for maneuver and assistance in the transformation of the Ottoman Empire. Thank you so much for your attention. We will be happy to answer 2 questions.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you. So now is the time for our question and answer session. We'll have about 20 minutes to get through that. Some people have asked questions already. I'll get to those shortly, but just a reminder for anyone who has a question for any of our past 3 papers presenters to add that to the Q&A. Okay, I have some questions. However, I'm going to go with the audience first. And our first question is from Hussein Alul. This is a question for Gizem Pilavcı. Hussein asks, what a fascinating talk about the family's mobility as well as transnational circulation of their artworks. Do you know anything about the Manases diplomatic position in Europe, their integration into the local diplomatic and consular corps? Were they orientalized by their European peers, and how, if ever, did they try to oppose or resist that?
So, I mean, this is a question that I would like to be able to answer like in a very detailed way, and yet I haven't been able to like find enough sources to be able to construct the environment to the desired level, unfortunately. I do believe that they probably, judge it, like just, thinking about the context, that they must have had some orientalizing. And but to what extent they were able to integrate themselves remains a question to be answered. And that is why I think it's particularly valuable to try and like sort of place them in a global setting and try and look at the global diplomatic atmosphere. I don't think they were excluded. It really seems to me though, like because both Sebuh and Rupen had written to the Ottoman state about sort of deficient sort of funding and so on. Rupen early on in his career, and then Sebuh later on, and there are like detailed like sort of state documents basically, and some of them like by Sebuh himself detailing like all of the payments that hadn't been like sort of made and so on. So I do believe that this kind of like financial sort of problems probably sort of prevented them from joining in on all of these things to the level that they would have liked. But to what extent were they able to like sort of graft themselves onto these networks, as I said, remains a question to be answered. And these are my initial findings. I do hope that I will be able to answer that question in a more detailed way. So, after like, sort of, working, keeping sort of on working on this like topic.
Okay, thank you for that answer. The next question is from Dimitrios Stergiopoulos. He asks, he says, thank you so much for your presentations. I would like to ask you to tell us more regarding the relationship between the Manas family and Glavany family with the other bankers of Galata. Were they involved in financing the Ottoman state after the Crimean War as other bankers did? Also, what were their attitude towards Ottoman Greek bureaucrats, such as the Karafiodori family?
So I should point out that the Armenian bankers and the Manases among them were actually sort of like engaged in banking practices before the 1850s. So they were sort of like the people that sort of were part of that earlier infrastructure. And, you know, in the 1850s, we obviously get these like European banking practices and Levantines coming to the fore. And I think there's a disconnect between them and between that sort of the Levantines in that respect. I don't know anything specifically about sort of the Manases, or I can't think, you know, off the top of my head, anything sort of specifically about like the relationship between the Glavany and the Manases. I should say, though, that the Manases weren't, as much as they were like bankers, and obviously banking, sort of being banker, like being a banker was like a very sort of, you know, prestigious position to have had. But there's obviously like, you know, different levels of like banking, and sort of there is evidence that they were employed in state service. The Manases were employed in state service, but they weren't sort of in the upper echelons of like the banking community. Yet they were, for instance, they had an estate in Tarabya, which was primarily populated by Armenian emirs and sort of bankers. But as I said, the period is a little bit different in that regard, I think, in terms of their banking practices.
Okay. And what about,
so probably we have a say in this question as well, because it is directed to more than one presenter. We are asked whether these families were involved in financing the Ottoman state after the Crimean War. I mean, in terms of the economic history of the Ottoman Empire, the reason why the Ottomans resorted to foreign borrowing was because the domestic borrowing opportunities actually ended. So the Ottoman Empire needed more money, more and more money that couldn't be satisfied by the local borrowing opportunities. So, but most families, bankers, then turned toward investing in public infrastructure. But definitely, probably they might have interesting connections in the meantime. But which will take us a lot of places to explore, but definitely we cannot definitively say that they weren't connected at all. Probably they were connected in some ways, because such dense networks were involved many people of influence, and Manases and Glavany's probably met at some time in their lives, but this requires further study. And regarding the last question, Alexandra answered.
Moreover, it's interesting to consider that this period in Istanbul, they were operating many societies. So in these societies, they had the opportunity, members of different communities, to interact with each other. Also, Levantines were interacting with rooms, with Greek Ottomans, also with Muslim Ottomans. So it's interesting to check, for example, proceedings of these societies, such as the Philological Society of Constantinople, and you will find members of the Glavanys and other Levantine and Greek Ottoman families, and bankers and investors operating together. So that's an interesting way to approach that. We didn't work on this particularly, so but it would be helpful regarding your question.
And are you going to read the last question so that we can answer? Or
yeah, exactly. Whilst you're on the line, yes, Orkun Koca asks whether you had the chance to check travel accounts of the period mentioning this family.
Yes, we haven't. Travel accounts are definitely a must for such explorations, but we have used the previously unused records of baptism, burial for the Catholic in Catholic archives, and also we relied heavily on Ottoman archives to uncover their economic networks. Of course, travelogues are helpful in exploring, for instance, the social dimension of such stories, and they will definitely contribute a lot to the portrayal of the networks of such families. But short answer, no.
Okay, thank you. If any other members of the audience have a question, go ahead, add it to the Q&A or to the chat. I will use my privilege as moderator to direct a question to Pınar. She hasn't had one yet. And I suppose it might be it's rather a meta question, and it's really whether your findings with regard to these Russian scholars confirm or diverge from the, from Said's thesis of Orientalism, which was obviously mostly built by looking at British and French scholars and so really the question is, how much do you see Russian scholarship in Palestine as, aligned with Russia's kind of territorial ambitions in the Ottoman Empire or imperialist mentalities, or whether you feel it provides a counterexample to the evidence Said presents?
Sure, this is a question I get very often. The Russian scholars themselves were very much aware of the fact that Russia has a unique position between Europe and Asia. And actually in the publications of the Palestine Society, I have seen some references by Russian scholars who criticized Western European scholarship on Muslim communities, on Palestine, on Syria, on the Ottoman Empire. They claim that these Western Europeans are just too biased, they have stereotypes, whereas they see themselves as Russians closer to understanding these Asiatic peoples or Near Eastern peoples. After all, they are not that Western. So Russian scholars consciously tried to create bridges with locals by emphasizing their unique position between Europe and Asia. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they were free of stereotypes themselves. So actually, there was some exoticization of Orthodox Arab communities. Many Russian scholars, or at least not only scholars, academics, but some bureaucrats leading this society, regarded Orthodox Arabs as pure embodiments of Orthodox faith. They believed that their orthodoxy was the uncorrupted version and it had to be protected as such. And this is why they were critical of Greek ecclesiastical authorities, because they criticized Greeks for not caring for the education of Orthodox Arabs, leaving them to the mercy of European imperialists. As for your question, there was definitely so much link between imperial ambitions, territorial ambitions, and these scholarly projects. I mean, this is so openly stated even in academic journals, academic texts, but also in diplomatic correspondence between the bureaucrats leading the society and imperial bureaucracy in St. Petersburg. So that was definitely an imperial mentality behind.
Okay, thanks very much. We have a couple more questions. One has come in from the chat, because I believe that when you're a panelist, you cannot ask a question using the Q&A feature. So that's a note for our panelists. We'll have to use the chat to ask their question. So this is a question from one of our presenters today, Vazken Davidian, who has a question for Gizem Pilavcı. Vazken says, thanks very much for a fascinating paper, Gizem. Could you please say something about Rupen and Sebu's, but also other Manases' artistic training and education? Were they trained at the MacArthur-Seal schools in Venice and Paris?
Sure. So we know for a fact that Gaspar and Alexandra, so the two younger sons of Zeno, they have been educated at the Vienna Academy of Art. And I have actually some sort of, documents from there verifying this. But we don't know where Rupen and Sebu, so the older two sons of Zeno, had received their education. So Rupen was he migrated back and forth between Paris and Istanbul from 1846 and 1854. And most of the state correspondence we have on the matter is regarding Rupen's continuation of his painting training. So it is unclear though where he continued this training. We know that he was in Paris, but we don't know if he was frequenting a painter's studio, or if he was attending a well-known institution. But just again, judging by the context and knowing Zenop was also the first diplomat painter, and his two younger sons had been educated at the prestigious institute that is the Vienna Art Academy. I'm guessing they too were sort of they too attended good institutions, but we don't know exactly which institutions these were.
Okay, hopefully that's enough of an answer for now, Vazkan. There is one last question. It's again from Hussein Alul, but it's directed to Efe and Alexandra. Hussein writes, thanks so much for your talk. I wonder whether Levantine is the only category we could use to identify the Glavany family and their place in Ottoman fabric and foreign affairs. I was also intrigued by your reference to the 1875 Rumelia Railroad project. And Hussein also asks, who was Faustin Glavany representing in this project? The financial interests of his own family or French and Belgian capital? And did this railway project ever materialize? So a two-part question there.
Thanks for this question. Sticking to the Levantine is a better option than other denominators, because Levantine is an umbrella term for many things. And as I told, it is a very fluid character that includes different languages, different religious identities. They were mostly Catholic and speaking French, Italian, whatever, but they were not considered too European by their counterparts in territorial Europe, or too Ottoman by their non-Muslim counterparts in Istanbul. So it's better to stick with Levantine, we are thinking. And with regards to the railroad project, the Rumelia Railroad project eventually became as the poster shows, the Chemin de Fer Oriental. But unfortunately, the political turmoil in the last decades of the Balkan Peninsula was so bad that this project actually stopped after a while, and many nations involved in it actually ended their partnership in it. But eventually, of course, it was completed and hosted the famous Orient Express. But during the last years of the Ottoman Empire, it was only limited to Eastern Thrace, for instance. But it was definitely not only the Belgians, as the Belgians were interested in building railroads in different parts of the empire, but it was a multinational project. And the Glavany's were actually representing the interests of both Belgian and Ottoman side. They were basically negotiating the price, but also conveying the diplomatic correspondence between the two parties in that. So this is, I guess, our answers to this question.
Okay, thanks very much. We now have, that was a great first panel. Thanks to all the speakers. I'm sure there will be more questions in the course of the day, which you might have a chance to respond to. If there are unanswered questions from the audience, you're welcome to get in touch with myself or with the speakers directly, and we'll do our best to answer those. We now have a lunch break of 1 hour. So what I'm going to do is this Zoom session will remain up. I will put up our screensaver, which includes the program for today, and we will disappear for an hour. Please enjoy your lunch break, or it might be your breakfast or dinner or break or wine break, wherever you happen to be and whatever your personal habits are. Thanks again, and thanks for bearing with us through the technical difficulties. Hopefully the rest of the day will run more smoothly. Cheers.